What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be taking a look at the new Burst Mode attachment that was added with Season 3 of Battlefield 6, because there's quite a bit of confusion surrounding this, and honestly, I'm still a little bit confused about it, and you'll see why as we go through this video. But with this attachment, it's in the Ergonomic section, and it's only available on a small handful of guns. It turns out it's available on all of the guns that we already had the ability to toggle over to Burst Mode. And you can still do that after this update as well without using this attachment. But on top of those guns, it's also available on two additional guns, the GRT-BC Carbine and the SL9 SMG. With those guns, you can only access Burst Mode if you use this attachment. But with this attachment, according to the description, when in Burst Mode specifically, it's designed to reduce your horizontal recoil in favor of more stable vertical recoil, and then it minimally reduces overall recoil on the gun. And part of that, at least, is really similar to what you see with the linear compensator or the converter in this game, where it mentions that it reduces horizontal recoil in favor of more stable vertical recoil. So with that in mind, let's dive into the guns that have access to this burst fire mode without using this attachment, and then toward the end, we'll get into the more interesting use of this on the two additional guns, where it actually changes up your rate of fire and time to kill values a little bit. But in the case of these guns where you can convert them into burst mode without using any attachments, you can just do it on the fly in-game. A quick recap on this, I have covered this in the past. This has no impact on our rate of fire, so there's no burst delay or anything that's introduced. As long as you're pulling the trigger fast enough, you will have the exact same rate of fire as if you were just firing the gun full auto. And when I tested this in the past, keep in mind these are older recoil values, so recoil has changed a little bit since then overall, but the general trend is still there. You can see in some cases it does improve your recoil a little bit to swap over to this burst mode, but not in every case. And my conclusion with this back in the day was most of the time it's just not worth swapping over to that burst mode when you can just manually tap fire and achieve essentially the same results while still having full auto available if you need it in that moment. So does this new burst fire attachment change things? Well, let's dive in with our comparison. First off, on the cord, as you can see here on the left, that is still firing the gun in burst mode, but without the burst fire attachment put on. Whereas on the right, this is also in its 2-round burst mode with the attachment now equipped. And you can see in the case of the cord, there's a little more vertical climb to that. And you could argue, if you look very closely at those shots, there is less horizontal deviation within that. It's not bouncing side to side quite as much, although there is still some of that, and there is randomness mixed into the equation still, as with all recoil plots in this game. So you could make an argument that the recoil on the right is just looking a little bit better overall compared to the left. But is that worth 15 attachment points? Not in my opinion. I'd rather put those attachment points towards something that just helps a lot more with recoil in general. And that would also apply if I swapped over to the burst mode, if I did want to use it in the burst mode. In either case, the next one to look at here is the SG553R. This one has a 3-round burst. And in this case, it actually does look noticeably better when using this burst fire attachment on here. It's still fairly inaccurate, but it's less inaccurate than if you're not using this attachment. And that horizontal recoil has been corrected quite nicely there. Then after that, we got the PW5A3, and again, you can see maybe there's a little bit less horizontal drift when using this attachment, but realistically, looking at like overall accuracy between those plots, I really don't see this having too much of an impact on the outcome of most of your gunfights in the game. As for the UMG40, kind of a similar story there. You could argue that that's tightening up your horizontal spread a little bit, especially as you continue firing the gun, but it's not like head and shoulders more accurate than not using this attachment. Same thing with the KV9, really not seeing a huge discrepancy here between having this attachment or not having it equipped. And then finally, another gun that I actually didn't realize had access to burst mode by default is the CZ3A1, which was added after I did my initial video on these burst guns. And you can see in this case, definitely seems to be increasing that vertical recoil and maybe helping a little bit with some of that horizontal recoil, but not by a whole lot. So overall, when it comes to these guns that have access to their burst mode by default without having to use this attachment, I really just can't justify using 15 attachment slots on this, when much of the time it's not even a noticeable difference at all. Like I said, I'd rather put those 15 attachment slots into a more aggressive underbarrel, for instance, that has much better recoil control overall, because that's going to end up helping with your recoil quite a bit more than this burst fire attachment. And I did double check and test, and there's no rate of fire differences or anything like that on these particular guns when using that burst fire attachment. So I would recommend just staying away from that on these existing guns. However, as I said at the beginning, there are two special guns here that have access to this new burst fire attachment, and yet without the attachment, they have no access to burst fire on their own. And the first of these two is the GRT-BC in the carbine category. And with this, the burst fire attachment only costs 10 points rather than the 15 points for all of the previous guns I've covered. And there is a bit of a rate of fire difference and therefore time to kill difference here because they introduced a slight burst delay while keeping the rate of fire within each 3-round burst the same as if you were firing full auto. And that burst delay based on my hand testing appears to be 35 milliseconds, which is not a large burst delay by any means, but it's there and it will have an impact on your time to kill. It turns out, up close with a 4-shot kill, we're now killing in 251 milliseconds rather than 217 milliseconds if you're using full auto with this gun. And then at long range, where that bumps up to a 7-shot kill, it's now taking us 502 milliseconds to kill rather than 434. So it may seem like not a good idea to use this attachment. However, in this case, we're actually noticing a very noticeable recoil improvement if we compare to the full auto mode, since we obviously can't compare to using burst without this attachment because you can't do that. So our best case is comparing to full auto. And in this case, it is far more accurate than the full auto version of this gun. And as a result, it may be worth that slight time to kill sacrifice that you're making by using this attachment. And in the case of the GRT-BC, I think this is a very viable attachment if you just want to do something a little bit different and try the gun in a different mode. It does feel almost like an entirely different gun in this case. However, another thing to keep in mind with this gun compared to the previous ones I've covered is once you put this attachment on, you lose access to full auto on the gun. So you can't toggle over to full auto like you could with the previous guns. You're stuck in either a 3-round burst mode or you can toggle over to semi-auto as well, but that's it. In either case, that's just the first one of these unique guns that have access to this. The other gun that has access is in the SMG category. We've got the SL9. And in this case, you'll see in the menus, you actually get a rate of fire boost. And this is referring to the rate of fire within each of the 2-round bursts. And it's now bumped up to 771 rounds per minute, which is very noticeably better than our standard full auto rate of fire. However, we do once again have a burst delay here as well, at roughly 25 milliseconds based on my testing. However, even with that burst delay, our rate of fire increase more than makes up for that, so we actually end up with a slightly faster time to kill in burst mode with the SL9 compared to full auto. As you can see, with a 4-shot kill, we're now killing in 259 milliseconds, which is down from 267 in full auto. Whereas when we get out to a distance up to an 8-shot kill, we have effectively the exact same time to kill at this point. So as you continue firing, you start to lose those advantages of having that higher rate of fire within each burst because you're dealing with more burst delays in between. But overall, as long as you're hitting all your bullets, you're always going to kill at least as fast as full auto, and in some cases, very slightly faster. So there's an actual benefit there. And then when we look at recoil, as you can see, there is essentially zero spread when using this attachment, and it kicks straight vertical. There is like no horizontal deviation here whatsoever. While the SL9 is very accurate in full auto, it is insanely accurate with this 2-round burst. And this is a case where I would say the 2-round burst is a great attachment on the SL9 because it's even more accurate and you have the potential to kill faster. And I don't know if I mentioned yet, this also only costs 10 attachment points rather than 15 like with the early guns that I showed. And as a result, when it comes to the guns that already have access to burst mode without having to use an attachment, I really think it would be a mistake to be using this attachment on any of those due to its hefty attachment cost and hardly noticeable recoil improvements. If anything, in its current state for those guns, it should probably be like a 5 attachment cost, or it should just give you more notable recoil improvements so you can actually tell the difference. However, in the case of the 2 other guns, the GRT-BC and the SL9, this is a solid option on those if you want just a bit of a different way to use these guns, because you're actually seeing some real advantages to using that. And therefore, if you haven't tried it yet, I would definitely give it a shot on those 2 guns, while totally ignoring it on all of the rest. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this burst mode attachment in those comments down below. Are you guys generally enjoying this? Do you agree that something should probably be done with this attachment on all of those early guns that I covered that already have access to burst mode without an attachment? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.